Chapter 7. German Templarism and French Illuminism. The year after Ramsay's oration, that is to say in 1738, Frederick, Crown Prince of Prussia, the future Frederick the Great, who for 2 years had been carrying on a correspondence with Voltaire, suddenly evinced a curiosity to know the secrets of Freemasonry, which he had hitherto derided as Kinderspiel, and accordingly went through a hasty initiation during the night of August 14th to 15th, whilst passing through Brunswick. The ceremony took place not at a Masonic lodge, but at a hotel, in the presence of a deputation summoned by the Graf von Lippe-Bickberg from Grand Lodge of Hamburg for the occasion. It is evident that something of an unusual kind must have occurred to necessitate these speedy and makeshift arrangements. Carlyle, in his account of the episode, endeavors to pass it off as a very trifling circumstance, a reason the more for regarding it as of the highest importance, since we know now from facts that have recently come to light how carefully Carlyle was spoon-fed by Potsdam whilst writing his book on Frederick the Great. But let us follow Frederick's Masonic career. In June 1740, after his accession to the throne, his interest in Masonry had clearly not waned, for we find him presiding over a lodge at Charlottenburg, where he received into the order 2 of his brothers, his brother-in-law, and Duke Frederick William of Holstein-Beck. At his desire the Baron de Bielefeld and his Privy Councillor Jordan founded a lodge at Berlin, the Three Globes, which by 1746 had no less than 14 lodges under its jurisdiction. In this same year of 1740 Voltaire, in response to urgent invitations, paid his first visit to Frederick the Great in Germany. Voltaire is usually said not to have yet become a Mason, and the date of his initiation is supposed to have been 1778, when he was received into the Loge de Neuf Sœurs in Paris. But this by no means precludes the possibility that he had belonged to another Masonic order at an earlier date. At any rate, Voltaire's visit to Germany was followed by 2 remarkable events in the Masonic world of France. The first of these was the institution of the additional degrees. The second, perhaps not wholly unconnected with the first, was the arrival in Paris of a Masonic delegate from Germany named von Marschall, who brought with him instructions for a new or rather a revived order of Templarism, in which he attempted to interest Prince Charles Edward and his followers. Von Marschall was followed about 2 years later by Baron von Hunt, who had been initiated in 1741 into the 3 degrees of craft masonry in Germany, and now came to consecrate a lodge in Paris. According to von Hunt's own account, he was then received into the Order of the Temple by an unknown Knight of the Red Plume, in the presence of Lord Kilmarnock, and was presented as a distinguished brother to Prince Charles Edward, whom he imagined to be Grand Master of the Order. But all this was afterwards shown to be a pure fabrication, for Prince Charles Edward denied all knowledge of the affair, and von Hunt himself admitted later that he did not know the name of the lodge or chapter in which he was received, but that he was directed from a hidden center, and by unknown superiors, whose identity he was bound not to reveal. In reality it appears that von Hunt's account was exactly the opposite of the truth, and that it was von Hunt who, seconding von Marschall's effort, tried to enroll Prince Charles Edward in the new German order by assuring him that he could raise powerful support for the Stuart cause under the cover of reorganizing the Templar order, of which he claimed to possess the true secrets handed down from the knights of the 14th century, by way of further rehabilitating the order. Von Hunt declared that all the accusations brought against it by Philippe le Bel and the Pope were based on false charges manufactured by 2 recreant knights named Nafadii and Florian as a revenge for having been deprived of their commands by the order in consequence of certain crimes they had committed. According to Lecouteul's de Canteleu, von Hunt eventually succeeded, after the defeat of Culloden, in persuading Prince Charles Edward to enter his order. But this is extremely doubtful. At any rate, when in 1751 von Hunt officially founded his new Templar order under the name of the Stride Observance, the unfortunate Charles Edward played no part at all in the scheme. As Mr. Gould has truly observed, no trace of Jacobite intrigues ever blended with the teaching of the Stride Observance. The Order of the Stride Observance was in reality a purely German association composed of men drawn entirely from the intellectual and aristocratic classes and, in imitation of the chivalric orders of the past, known to each other under knightly titles. Thus Prince Charles of Hesse became Iches a Leon Resurgent, Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick Iches a Victoria, the Prussian minister von Bischofswerder Iches a Griffo, Baron de Wachter Iches a Sarasso, Christian Bode, Councillor of Legation in Saxe-Gotha, Iches a Lilio Con, Valium. Von Haugwitz, Cabinet Minister of Frederick the Great, Iches a Monte Sancto, etc. But according to the declarations of the order, the official leaders, Knights of the Moon, the Star, the Golden Sun, or the Sacred Mountain, were simply figureheads. The real leaders, known as the unknown superiors, remained in the background. Unadorned by titles of chivalry, but exercising supreme jurisdiction over the order. The system had been foreshadowed by the Invisibles of 17th-century Rosicrucianism, but now, instead of an intangible group whose very existence was only known vaguely to the world, there appeared in the fight of day a powerful organization led apparently by men of influence and position, yet secretly directed by hidden chiefs. Mirabeau has described the advent of these mysterious directors in the following passage. In about 1756 there appeared, as if they had come out of the ground, men sent, they said, by unknown superiors, and armed with powers to reform the order of Freemasonry and re-establish it in its ancient purity. One of these missionaries, named Johnston, came to Weimar and Jena, where he established himself. He was received in the best way in the world by the brothers, Freemasons, who were lured by the hope of great secrets, of important discoveries which were never made known to them. Now, in the manuscripts of the Prince of Hesse published by Lecatolles de Canteleu, it is said that this man Johnston, or rather Johnson, who proclaimed himself to be Grand Prior of the Order, was a Jew named Leicht or Lucht. Gould says that his real name was either Lucht or Becker, but that he professed to be an Englishman, although unable to speak the English language, hence his assumption of the name Johnson. Mr. Gould has described Johnson as a consummate rogue and an unmitigated vagabond, of almost repulsive demeanor and of no education, but gifted with boundless impudence and low cunning. Indeed, von Hunt himself, after enlisting Johnson's services, found him too dangerous and declared him to be an adventurer. J. Onsen was thereupon arrested by von Hunt's friend the Councillor von Pritsch, and thrown into the castle of Wartburg, where sudden death ended his career. It is, however, improbable that Mirabeau could be right in indicating Johnson as one of the unknown superiors, who were doubtless men of vaster conceptions than this adventurer appears to have been. Moreover, the manner of his end clearly proves that he occupied a subordinate position in the Stride Observance. Here, then, we have a very curious sequence of events which it may be well to recapitulate briefly in order to appreciate their full significance. A 737, Oration of Chevalier Ramsay indicating Templar origin of Freemasonry, but making no mention of upper degrees. 1738. Du D'Antin becomes Grand Master of French Freemasonry in the place of Lord Harnewester. 1738. Frederick, Crown Prince of Prussia, initiated into Masonry at Brunswick. 1740. Voltaire pays his first visit to Frederick, now king. 1741. Baron von Marschall arrives in Paris with a plan for reviving the Templar order. Templar degrees first heard of in France under name of Scots Masonry. 1743. Arrival in France of Baron von Hunt with fresh plans for reviving the Templar Order. Degree of Night Kadosh celebrating vengeance of Templars said to have been instituted at Lyons. 1750. Voltaire goes to spend 3 years with Frederick. 1751. Templar Order of the Strict Observance founded by von Hunt. 1754. Rite of Perfection, early form of Scottish Rite, founded in France. 1761. Frederick acknowledged head of Scottish Rite. Morin sent to found Rite of Perfection in America. 1762. Grand Masonic Constitutions ratified in Berlin. It will be seen then that what Mr. Gould describes as the flood of Templarism, which both he and Mr. Tuckett attribute to the so-called Scots Masons, corresponds precisely with the decline of Jacobite and the rise of German influence. Would it not therefore appear probable that, except in the case of the Rose-Croix degree, the authors of the upper degrees were not Scotsmen nor Jacobites, that Scots Masonry was a term used to cover not merely Templarism, but more especially German Templarism, and that the real author and inspirer of the movement was Frederick the Great? Now, it is significant to find that in the history of the Ordre du Temple, published at the beginning of the 19th century, Frederick the Great is cited as one of the most distinguished members of this order in the past, and the Abbé Grégoire adds that he was consecrated at Ramersburg, Rheinsberg, in 1738, that is to say in the same year that he was initiated into Masonry at Brunswick. There is therefore a definite reason for connecting Frederick with Templarism at this date. I would suggest, then, that the truth about the Templar succession may be found in one of the two following theories. That the documents produced by the Ordre du Temple in the 19th century, including the Charter of l'Armenius, were genuine, that the order had never ceased to exist since the days of the Crusades, that the Templar heresy was Johannism, but that this was not held by the Templars who escaped to Scotland, that the Rose-Croix degree in its purely Christian form was introduced by the Scottish Templars to Scotland and 400 years later brought by Ramsay to France, that the master of the temple at this date was the regent, Philippe du d'Orléans, as stated in the Charter of l'Armenius. Finally, that after this, fresh Templar degrees were introduced from Germany by von Hunt, acting on behalf of Frederick the Great. That the documents produced by the Ordre du Temple in the 19th century were, as M. Matter declares, early 18th century fabrications, that although, in view of the tradition preserved in the Royal Order of Scotland, there appears to be good reason to believe the story of the Scottish Templars and the origin of the Rose-Croix degree, the rest of the history of the Templars, including the Charter of l'Armenius, was an invention of the concealed superiors of the Stride observance in Germany, and that the most important of these concealed superiors were Frederick the Great and Voltaire. I shall not attempt to decide which of these two theories is correct. All that I do maintain is that in either case the preponderating role in Templarism at this crisis was played by Frederick the Great, probably with the cooperation of Voltaire, who in his essay Sur les Messieurs championed the cause of the Templars. Let us follow the reasons for arriving at this conclusion. Ramsay's oration in 1737 connecting Freemasonry with the Templars may well have come to the ears of Frederick and suggested to him the idea of using Masonry as a cover for his intrigues, hence his hasty initiation at Brunswick. But in order to acquire influence in a secret society, it is always necessary to establish a claim to superior knowledge, and Templarism seemed to provide a fruitful source of inspiration. For this purpose new light must be thrown on the order. Now, there was probably no one better qualified than Voltaire, with his knowledge of the ancient and medieval world, and hatred of the Catholic Church, to undertake the construction of a historical romance subversive of the Catholic faith, hence the urgent summons to the philosopher to visit Frederick. We can imagine Voltaire delving amongst the records of the past in order to reconstruct the Templar heresy. This was clearly Gnostic, and the Mandeans or Christians of St. John may well have appeared to present the required characteristics. If it could be shown that here in Johannism true primitive Christianity was to be found, what a blow for the infame! A skillful forger could easily be found to fabricate the documents said to have been preserved in the secret archives of the order. Further, we find von Marschall arriving in the following year in France to reorganize the Templars, and von Hunt later claiming to be in possession of the true secrets of the order handed down from the 14th century. That some documents bearing on this question were either discovered or fabricated under the direction of Frederick the Great seems the more probable from the existence of a Masonic tradition to this effect. Thus Dr. Oliver quotes a report of the Grand Inspectors General in the 19th century stating that during the Crusades, at which 27,000 Masons were present, some Masonic MSS of great importance were discovered among the descendants of the ancient Jews, and that other valuable documents were found at different periods down to the year of light 5557, i.e. 553, AT, which time a record came to light in Syrian characters, relating to the most remote antiquity, and from which it would appear that the world is many thousand years older than given by the Mosaic account. Few of these characters were translated till the reign of our illustrious and most enlightened brother Frederick II, King of Prussia, whose well-known zeal for the craft was the cause of so much improvement in the society over which he condescended to preside. I suggest, then, that the documents here referred to and containing the secrets claimed by von Hunt may have been the ones afterwards published by the Ordre du Temple in the 19th century, and that if unauthentic they were the work of Voltaire, aided probably by a Jew capable of forging Syriac manuscripts. That Johnson was the Jew in question seems probable, since Findel definitely asserts that the history of the continuation of the Order of Knights Templar was his work. Frederick, as we know, was in the habit of employing Jews to carry out shady transactions, and he may well have used Johnson to forge documents as he used Ephraim to coin alms money for him. It would be further quite in keeping with his policy to get rid of the man as soon as he had served his purpose, lest he should betray his secrets. At any rate, whatever were the methods employed by Frederick the Great for obtaining control over Masonry, the fruitful results of that very trifling circumstance, his initiation at Brunswick, become more and more apparent as the century advances. Thus when in 1786 the Rite of Perfection was reorganized and rechristened the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, always the same Scottish cover for Prussianism. It is said to have been Frederick who conducted operations, drew up the new constitutions of the order, and rearranged the degrees so as to bring the total number up to 33, as follows. 26. Prince of Mercy. 27. Sovereign Commander of the Temple. 28. Knight of the Sun. 29. Grand Scotch Knight of St. Andrew. 30. Grand Elect Knight of Kadosh. 31. Grand Inspector Inquisitor Commander. 32. Sublime Prince of the Royal Secret. 33. Sovereign Grand Inspector General. In the last 4 degrees Frederick the Great and Prussia play an important part. In the 30th degree of Knight Kadosh, largely modeled on the Wemgeritz, the knights were Teutonic crosses, the throne is surmounted by the double-headed eagle of Prussia, and the president, who is called thrice puissant Grand Master, represents Frederick himself, in the 32nd degree of Sublime Prince of the Royal Secret. Frederick is described as the head of continental Freemasonry, in the 33rd degree of Sovereign Grand Inspector General, the jewel is again the double-headed eagle, and the Sovereign Grand Commander is Frederick, who at the time this degree was instituted figured with Philippe du d'Orléans, Grand Master of the Grand Orient, as his lieutenant. The most important of these innovations was the 32nd degree, which was in reality a system, rather than a degree for bringing together the Masons of all countries under one head, hence the immense power acquired by Frederick. By 1786 French Masonry was thus entirely Prussianized, and Frederick had indeed become the idol of Masonry everywhere. Yet probably no one ever despised Freemasonry more profoundly. As the American Mason Albert Pike shrewdly observed, there is no doubt that Frederick came to the conclusion that the great pretensions of Masonry in the blue degrees were merely imaginary and deceptive. He ridiculed the order and thought its ceremonies mere child's play, and some of his sayings to that effect have been preserved. It does not at all follow that he might not at a later day have found it politic to put himself at the head of an order that had become a power. It is not without significance to find that in the year following the official foundation of the Stride observance, that is to say in 1752, Lord Holderness, in a letter to the British ambassador in Paris, Lord Albemarle, headed "Very Secret," speaks of the influence which the King of Prussia has of late obtained over all the French councils, and a few weeks later Lord Albemarle refers to the great influence of the Prussian court over the French councils, by which they are so blinded as not to be able to judge for themselves. But it is time to turn to another sphere of activity, which Masonry opened out to the ambitions of Frederick. The making of the encyclopedia, which even those writers the most skeptical with regard to secret influences behind the revolutionary movement admit to have contributed towards the final cataclysm, is a question on which official history has thrown but little light. According to the authorized version of the story as related, for example, in Lord Morley's work on the Encyclopedists, the plan of translating Ephraim Chambers' Sixtia, which had appeared in 1728, was suggested to Diderot some 15 years later by a French bookseller named Le Breton. Diderot's fertile and energetic intelligence transformed the scheme. It was resolved to make Chambers' work a mere starting point for a new enterprise of far wider scope. We then go on to read of the financial difficulties that now beset the publisher, of the embarrassment of Diderot, who felt himself unequal to the task of arranging and supervising every department of a new book that was to include the whole circle of the sciences, of the fortunate enlisting of D'Alembert as a collaborator, and later of men belonging to all kinds of professions, all united in a work that was as useful as it was laborious, without any view of interest, without any common understanding and agreement, further, of the cruel persecutions encountered at the hands of the Jesuits, who had expected at least to have control of the articles on theology, and finally of the tyrannical suppression of the great work on account of the anti-Christian tendencies these same articles displayed. Now for a further light on the matter. In the famous speech of the Chevalier Ramsay already quoted, which was delivered at Grand Lodge of Paris in 1737, the following passage occurs. The fourth quality required in our order is the taste for useful sciences and the liberal arts. Thus, the order exacts of each of you to contribute, by his protection, liberality, or labor, to a vast work for which no academy can suffice, because all these societies being composed of a very small number of men, their work cannot embrace an object so extended. All the Grand Masters in Germany, England, Italy, and elsewhere exhort all the learned men, and all the artisans of the fraternity to unite to furnish the materials for a universal dictionary of all the liberal arts and useful sciences, excepting only theology and politics. The work has already been commenced in London, and by means of the unions of our brothers it may be carried to a conclusion in a few years. So after all it was no enterprising bookseller, no brilliantly inspired philosopher, who conceived the idea of the encyclopedic, but a powerful international organization able to employ the services of more men than all the academies could supply, which devised the scheme at least 6 years before the date at which it is said to have occurred to Diderot. Thus the whole story as usually told to us would appear to be a complete fabrication. Struggling publishers, toiling literateurs carrying out their superhuman task as independent men of letters, without the patronage of the great, which Lord Morley points out as one of the most important facts in the history of the encyclopedia. Writers of all kinds bound together by no common understanding or agreement are all seen in reality to have been closely associated as artisans of the fraternity carrying out the orders of their superiors. The Encyclopédie was therefore essentially a Masonic publication, and Papus, whilst erroneously attributing the famous oration, and consequently the plan of the encyclopedic to the inspiration of the Du D'Antin, emphasizes the importance of this fact. Thus, he writes, "The revolution manifests itself by 2 stages. First, intellectual revolution, by the publication of the encyclopedic, due to French Freemasonry under the high inspiration of the Du D'Antin. Second, occult revolution in the lodges, due in great part to the members of the Templar Rite, and executed by a group of expelled Freemasons afterwards amnestied." The Masonic authorship of the encyclopedic and the consequent dissemination of revolutionary doctrines has remained no matter of doubt to the Freemasons of France. On the contrary, they glory in the fact. At the Congress of the Grand Orient in 1904, the Freemason bonnet declared, "In the 18th century the glorious line of encyclopedists formed in our temples a fervent audience, which was then alone in invoking the radiant device as yet unknown to the crowd: liberty, equality, fraternity." The revolutionary seed quickly germinated amidst this elite. Our illustrious Freemasons d'Alembert, Diderot, Helvetius, d'Holbach, Voltaire, Condorcet, completed the evolution of minds and prepared the new era. And, when the Bastille fell, Freemasonry had the supreme honor of giving to humanity the Charter, i.e. the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which it had elaborated with devotion. Applause. This charter, the orator went on to say, was the work of the Freemason Lafayette, and was adopted by the Constituent Assembly, of which more than 300 members were Freemasons. But in using the lodges to sow the seeds of revolution, the encyclopedists betrayed not only the cause of monarchy, but of Masonry as well. It will be noticed that, in conformity with true Masonic principles, Ramsay in his oration expressly stated that the encyclopedia was to concern itself with the liberal arts and sciences, and that theology and politics were to be excluded from the contemplated scheme. How, then, did it come to pass that these were eventually the 2 subjects to which the encyclopedists devoted the greatest attention, so that their work became principally an attack on church and monarchy? If Papus was right in attributing this revolutionary tendency to the encyclopedic from the time of the famous oration, then Ramsay could only be set down as the profoundest hypocrite, or as the mouthpiece of hypocrites professing intentions the very reverse of their real designs. A far more probable explanation seems to be that during the interval between Ramsay's speech and the date when the encyclopedic was begun in earnest, the scheme underwent a change. It will be noticed that the year of 1746, when Diderot and d'Alembert are said to have embarked on their task, coincided with the decadence of French Freemasonry under the Comte de Clermont and the invasion of the lodges by the subversive elements. Thus the project propounded with the best intentions by the Freemasons of 1737 was filched by their revolutionary successors and turned to a diametrically opposite purpose. But it is not to the dancing master Lacombe and his middle-class following that we can attribute the efficiency with which not only the encyclopedic, but a host of minor revolutionary publications were circulated all over France. Frederick the Great had seen his opportunity. If I am right in my surmise that Ramsay's speech had reached the ears of Frederick, the prospect of the encyclopedic contained therein may well have appeared to him a magnificent method for obtaining a footing in the intellectual circles of France, hence then, doubtless, an additional reason for his hasty initiation into Masonry, his summons to Voltaire, and his subsequent overtures to Diderot and D'Alembert, who, by the time the first volume of the encyclopedia appeared in 1751, had both been made members of the Royal Academy of Prussia. In the following year Frederick offered D'Alembert the presidency of the Academy in place of Maupertuis, an offer which was refused, but in 1755, and again in 1763 D'Alembert visited Frederick in Germany, and received his pension regularly from Berlin. It is therefore not surprising that when the encyclopedic had reached the letter P, it included, in an unsigned article on Prussia, a panegyric on the virtues and the talents of the illustrious monarch who presided over the destinies of that favored country. The art of Frederick the Great, as of his successors on the throne of the Hohenzollerns, was to make use of every movement that could further the design of Prussian supremacy. He used the Freemasons as he used the philosophers, and as he used the Jews, to carry out his great scheme, the destruction of the French monarchy, and of the alliance between France and Austria. Whilst through his representatives at the court of France he was able to create discord between Versailles and Vienna, and bring discredit on Marie Antoinette, through his allies in the Masonic lodges, and in the secret societies he was able to reach the people of France. The gold and the printing presses of Frederick the Great were added to those of the ORL-anists for the circulation of seditious literature throughout the provinces. So as the century advanced, the association founded by Royalists and Catholics was turned into an engine of destruction by revolutionary intriguers. The rites and symbols were gradually perverted to an end directly opposed to that for which they had been instituted. And the 2 degrees of Rose, Croix and Night Kadash came to symbolize respectively war on religion and war on the monarchy of France. It is no Orthodox Catholic, but an occultist and Rosicrucian, who thus describes the role of Masonry in the Revolution. Masonry has not only been profaned, but it has even served as a cover and pretext for the plots of anarchy, by the occult influence of the avengers of Jacques du Molay, and the continuers of the schismatic work of the Temple. Instead of avenging the death of Hiram, they have avenged his assassins. The anarchists have taken the plumbline, the square, and the mallet, and have written on them liberty, equality, fraternity. That is to say, liberty for envyings, equality in degradation, fraternity for destruction. Those are the men whom the Church has justly condemned, and that she will always condemn. But it is time to turn to another Masonic power, which meanwhile had entered the lists, the Martinistes or French Illumines. French Illuminism. Whilst Frederick the Great, the Freemasons, the Encyclopedists, and the ORL-anists were working on the material plane to undermine the Church and monarchy in France, another cult had arisen which by the middle of the century succeeded in insinuating itself into the lodges. This was a recrudescence of the old craze for occultism, which now spread like wildfire all over Europe from Bordeaux to St. Petersburg. During the reign of Anna of Courland, 1730–40, the Russian court was permeated with superstition, and professional magicians and charlatans of every kind were encouraged. The upper classes of Germany in the 18th century proved equally susceptible to the attractions of the supernatural, and princes desirous of long life or greater power eagerly pursued the quest of the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, and evoked spirits under the direction of occultists in their service. In France, occultism, reduced to a system, adopted the outer forms of Masonry as a cover to the propagation of its doctrines. It was in 1754 that Martinus de Pasquale, or Pascalis, a Rose-Croix Mason, founded his order of Poundloes Cohens, elected priests, known later as the Martinistes or the French Illumines. Although brought up in the Christian faith, Pasquale has been frequently described as a Jew. The Baron de Gleichen, himself a Martinist and a member of the Amos Reunus, throws an interesting light on the matter in this passage. Pasquales was originally Spanish, perhaps of the Jewish race, since his disciples inherited from him a large number of Jewish manuscripts. It was this Kabbalistic sect, the Martinistes, which now became the third great Masonic power in France. The rite of the Martinistes was broadly divided into two classes, in the first of which was represented the fall of man, and in the second his final restoration, a further variation on the Masonic theme of a loss and a recovery. After the first three craft degrees came the Cohen degrees of the same apprentice Cohen, fellow craft Cohen, and master Cohen, then those of Grand Architect, Grand Elect of Zerubbabel or Knight of the East, but above these were concealed degrees leading up to the Rose-Croix, which formed the capstone of the edifice. Pasquale first established his rite at Marseilles, Toulouse, and Bordeaux, then in Paris, and before long Martinist lodges spread all over France, with the center at Lyons under the direction of Willermoz, a prosperous merchant living there. From this moment other occult orders sprang up in all directions. In 1760 Dom Pernetti founded his sect of Illumines d'Avignon in that city, declaring himself a high initiate of Freemasonry, and teaching the doctrines of Swedenborg. Later a certain Chastanier founded the Illumines Theosophies, a modified version of Pernetti's rite, and in 1783 the Marquis de Thomé started a purified variety of Swedenborgianism under the name of Rite of Swedenborg. Beneath all these occult sects one common source of inspiration is to be found the perverted and magical Kabbalah of the Jews. That conglomeration of wild theosophical imaginings and barbaric superstitions founded on ancient pagan cults and added to throughout 17 centuries by succeeding generations of Jewish occultists. This influence is particularly to be detected in the various forms of the Rose-Croix degree, which in nearly all these associations forms the highest and most secret degree. The ritual of the eminent order of the Knights of the Black Eagle, or Sovereigns of the Rose-Croix, a secret and unpublished document of the 18th century, which differs entirely from the published rituals, explains that no one can attain to knowledge of the higher sciences without the Clavicules de Salomon, of which the real secrets were never committed to print, and which is said to contain the whole of Kabbalistic science. The Catechism of this same degree deals mainly with the transmutation of metals, the philosopher's stone, etc. In the Rite of Perfection as worked in France and America, this Kabbalistic influence is shown in those degrees known under the name of the Ineffable Degrees, derived from the Jewish belief in the mystery that surrounds the ineffable name of God. According to the custom of the Jews, the sacred name Jehovah, or Javii, composed of the four letters Yod, He, Vav, He, which formed the Tetragrammaton, was never to be pronounced by the profane, who were obliged to substitute for it the word Adonai. The Tetragrammaton might only be uttered once a year on the Day of Atonement by the high priest in the Holy of Holies amid the sound of trumpets and cymbals, which prevented the people from hearing it. It is said that in consequence of the people thus refraining from its utterance, the true pronunciation of the name was at last lost. The Jews further believed that the Tetragrammaton was possessed of unbounded powers. He who pronounces it shakes heaven and earth and inspires the very angels with astonishment and terror. The ineffable name thus conferred miraculous gifts. It was engraved on the rod of Moses and enabled him to perform wonders, just as, according to the Toldat Yeshu, it conferred the same powers on Christ. This superstition was clearly a part of Rosicrucian tradition, for the symbol of the Tetragrammaton within a triangle, adopted by the Masonic lodges, figures and floods Kabbalistic system. In the ineffable degrees it was invested with all the mystic awe by which it is surrounded in Jewish theology and, according to early American working, brothers and companions of these degrees received the name of God as it was revealed to Enoch and were sworn to pronounce it but once in their lives. In the alchemical version of the Rose-Croix degree referred to above, the ineffable name is actually invested with magical powers as in the Jewish Kabbalah. Ragan, after describing the Jewish ceremony, when the word Jehovah was pronounced by the high priest in the Holy of Holies, goes on to say that Skem Hamphorish, another term for the tetragrammaton, forms the sacred word of a Scotch degree, and that this belief in its mystic properties will be found at the head of the instructions for the third degree of the Knight of the Black Eagle, called Rose-Croix, thus. Q. What is the most powerful name of God on the Pentaculum? A. Adonai. Q. What is its power? A. To move the universe. That one of the knights who had the good fortune to pronounce it Kabbalistically would have at his disposal the powers that inhabit the four elements and the celestial spirits, and would possess all the virtues possible to man. That this form of the Rose-Croix was of purely Jewish origin is thus clearly evident. In the address to the candidate for initiation into the Rose-Croix degree at the Lodge of the Contrat Social, it is stated, this degree, which includes an order of perfect Masons, was brought to light by Brother R., who took it from the Kabbalistic treasure of the Doctor and Rabbi N. Karademuth, chief of the Synagogue of Leiden in Holland, who had preserved its precious secrets and its costume, both of which we shall see in the same order in which he placed them in his mysterious Talmud. Now, we know that in the 18th century a society of Rosicrucian magicians had been instituted in Florence, which was believed to date back to the 15th century, and to have been partly, if not wholly, composed of Orientals, as we shall see in the next chapter. But it seems probable that this sect, whilst secretly inspiring the Rose-Croix Masons, was itself either nameless or concealed under a disguise. Thus in 1782 an English Freemason writes, I have found some rather curious MSS in Algiers in Hebrew relating to the Society of the Rosicrucians, which exists at present under another name with the same forms. I hope, moreover, to be admitted to their knowledge. It has frequently been argued that Jews can have played no part in Freemasonry at this period, since they themselves were not admitted to the lodges. But this is by no means certain. In the article from the Gentleman's Magazine already quoted, it is stated that Jews are admitted. De Lachey further quotes the instance of David Moses Hertz received in a London lodge in 1787. And the author of Les Frank Megan's Ecraces, published in 1746, states that he has seen 3 Jews received into a lodge at Amsterdam. In the Melchizedek lodges of the continent non-Christians were openly admitted, and here again the Rose-Croix degree occupies the most important place. The highest degrees of this rite were the initiated brothers of Asia, the masters of the wise, and the royal priests, otherwise known as the degree of Melchizedek, or the true brothers of the Rose-Croix. This order, usually described as the Asiatic Brethren, of which the center was in Vienna, and the leader a certain Baron von Eckhoffen, is said to have been a continuation of the Brothers of the Golden and Rosy Cross. A revival of the 17th century Rosicrucians organized in 1710 by a Saxon priest, Samuel Richter, known as Sincerus Renatus. The real origins of the Asiatic Brethren are, however, obscure, and little literature on the subject is to be found in this country. Their further title of the Knights and Brethren of St. John the Evangelist suggests Johann Knight inspiration, and was clearly an imposture, since they included Jews, Turks, Persians, and Armenians. De Lachey, who as a contemporary was in a position to acquire first-hand information, thus describes the organization of the order, which, it will be seen, was entirely Judaic. The superior direction is called the small and constant Sanhedrim of Europe. The names of those employed by which they conceal themselves from their inferiors are Hebrew. The signs of the third principal degree, i.e. the Rose Croix, are Urim and Thummim. The order has the true secrets and the explanations, moral and physical, of the hieroglyphics of the very venerable order of Freemasonry. The initiate had to swear absolute submission and unswerving obedience to the laws of the order, and to follow its laws implicitly to the end of his life, without asking by whom they were given or whence they came. Who, asks de Lachey, gave to the order these so-called secrets? That is the great and insidious question for the secret societies. But the initiate who remains, and must remain eternally in the order, never finds this out. He dare not even ask it, he must promise never to ask it. In this way those who participate in the secrets of the order remain the masters. Again, as in the stride observance, the same system of concealed superiors, the same blind obedience to unknown directors. Under the guidance of these various sects of illumines, a wave of occultism swept over France, and lodges everywhere became centers of instruction on the Kabbalah, magic, divination, alchemy, and theosophia. Masonic rites degenerated into ceremonies for the evocation of spirits. Women who were now admitted to these assemblies screamed, fainted, fell into convulsions, and lent themselves to experiments of the most horrible kind. By means of these occult practices the Illumines in time became the third great Masonic power in France, and the rival orders perceived the expediency of joining forces. Accordingly in 1771 an amalgamation of all the Masonic groups was effected at the new lodge of the Amos Reunius. The founder of this lodge was Savillette de Langes, Keeper of the Royal Treasury, Grand Officer of the Grand Orient, and a high initiate of Masonry versed in all mysteries, in all the lodges, and in all the plots. In order to unite them he made his lodge a mixture of all sophistic, Martinist, and Masonic systems, and as a bait to the aristocracy organized balls and concerts at which the adepts, male and female, danced and feasted, or sang of the beauties of their liberty and equality. Little knowing that above them was a secret committee, which was arranging to extend this equality beyond the lodge to rank and fortune, to castles, and to cottages, to marquises and bourgeois alike. A further development of the Amos Reunius was the rite of the Philolithes, compounded by Savillette de Langes in 1773 out of Swedenborgian, Martinist, and Rosicrucian mysteries, into which the higher initiates of the Amos Reunius, Court de Gebelin, the Prince de Hesse, Condorcet, the Vicomte de Tavannes, Willermoz, and others were initiated. A modified form of this rite was instituted at Narbonne in 1780 under the name of Free and Accepted Masons du Rit Primitif, the English nomenclature being adopted, according to Clavel, in order to make it appear that the rite emanated from England. In reality its founder, the Marquis de Chefdebien d'Armesson, a member of the Grand Orient and of the Amos Reunius, drew his inspiration from certain German Freemasons with whom he maintained throughout close relations, and who were presumably members of the strict observance. Since Chefdebien was a member of this order, in which he bore the title of Iches a Capite Gaelano, the correspondence that passed between Chefdebien and Savillette de Langes, recently discovered and published in France, is one of the most illuminating records of the Masonic ramifications in existence before the Revolution ever brought to light. To judge by the tone of these letters, the leaders of the RIT Primitif would appear to have been law-abiding and loyal gentlemen devoted to the Catholic religion. Yet in their passion for new forms of Masonry, and thirst for occult lore ready to associate themselves with every kind of adventurer and charlatan who might be able to initiate them into further mysteries, In the curious notes drawn up by Savillette for the guidance of the Marquis de Chefdedian we catch a glimpse of the power behind the philosophers of the salons, and the aristocratic adepts of the lodges, the professional magicians, and men of mystery, and behind these again the concealed directors of the secret societies, the real initiates, the magicians. The part played by magicians during the period preceding the French Revolution is of course a matter of common knowledge, and has never been disputed by official history. But like the schools of philosophers, this sudden crop of magicians is always represented as a sporadic growth called into being by the idle and curious society of the day. The important point to realize is that just as the philosophers were all Freemasons, the principal magicians were not only Freemasons, but members of occult secret societies. It is therefore not as isolated charlatans, but as agents of some hidden power, that we must regard the men whom we will now pass in a rapid survey. One of the first to appear in the field was Schroepfer, a coffee-house keeper of Leipzig, who declared that no one could be a true Freemason without practicing magic. Accordingly, he proclaimed himself the reformer of Freemasonry, and set up a lodge in his own house with a rite based on the Rose-Croix degree for the purpose of evoking spirits. The meetings took place at dead of night, when by means of carefully arranged lights, magic mirrors, and possibly of electricity, Schroepfer contrived to produce apparitions which his disciples under the influence of strong punch took to be visitors from the other world. In the end, Schroepfer, driven crazy by his own incantations, blew out his brains in a garden near Leipzig. According to Lecatol's de Canteleu, it was Schroepfer who indoctrinated the famous Comte de Saint-Germain, the master of our modern co-Masonic lodges. The identity of this mysterious personage has never been established. By some contemporaries he was said to be a natural son of the King of Portugal, by others the son of a Jew and a Polish princess. The Duc de Choiseul, on being asked whether he knew the origin of Saint-Germain, replied, "No doubt we know it. He is the son of a Portuguese Jew who exploits the credulity of the town and court." In 1780 a rumor went round that his father was a Jew of Bordeaux. But according to the souvenirs of the Marquis de Créquy, the Baron de Breteuil discovered from the archives of his ministry that the pretended Comte de Saint-Germain was the son of a Jewish doctor of Strasbourg, that his real name was Daniel Wolff, and that he was born in 1704. The general opinion thus appears to have been in favor of his Jewish ancestry. Saint-Germain seems first to have been heard of in Germany about 1740, where his marvelous powers attracted the attention of the Marquis de Belle-Isle, who, always the ready dupe of charlatans, brought him back with him to the court of France, where he speedily gained the favor of Madame de Pompadour. The Marquise before long presented him to the king, who granted him an apartment at Chambord, and, enchanted by his brilliant wit, frequently spent long evenings in conversation with him in the rooms of Madame de Pompadour. Meanwhile, his invention of flat-bottomed boats for the invasion of England raised him still higher in the estimation of the Marshal de Belle-Isle. In 1761 we hear of him as living in great splendor in Holland, and giving out that he had reached the age of 74, though appearing to be only 50. If this were so, he must have been 97 at the time of his death in 1784 at Schleswig. But this feat of longevity is far from satisfying his modern admirers, who declare that Saint-Germain did not die in 1784, but is still alive today in some corner of Eastern Europe. This is in accordance with the theory, said to have been circulated by Saint-Germain himself, that by the 18th century he had passed through several incarnations, and that the last one had continued for 1,500 years. Beruel, however, explains that Saint-Germain, in thus referring to his age, spoke in Masonic language, in which a man who has taken the first degree is said to be 3 years old, after the second 5, or the third 7. So that by means of the huge increase the higher degrees conferred it might be quite possible for an exalted adept to attain the age of 1,500. Saint Germain has been represented by modern writers, not only those who compose his following, as a person of extraordinary attainments, a sort of Superman towering over the minor magicians of his day. Contemporaries, however, take him less seriously and represent him rather as an expert charlatan whom the wits of the salons made the butt of pleasantries. His principal importance to the subject of this book consists, however, in his influence on the secret societies. According to the Memoires authentiques pour servir de l'histoire du Comte de Cagliostro, Saint Germain was the Grand Master of Freemasonry, and it was he who initiated Cagliostro into the mysteries of Egyptian masonry. Joseph Balsamo, born in 1743, who assumed the name of Comte de Cagliostro, as a magician far eclipsed his master. Like Saint Germain, he was generally reputed to be a Jew, the son of Pietro Balsamo, a Sicilian tradesman of Jewish origins, and he made no secret of his ardent admiration for the Jewish race. After the death of his parents, he escaped from the monastery, in which he had been placed at Palermo, and joined himself to a man known as Altotas, said to have been an Armenian, with whom he traveled to Greece and Egypt. Cagliostro's travels later took him to Poland and Germany, where he was initiated into Freemasonry, and finally to France, but it was in England that he himself declared that he elaborated his famous Egyptian rite, which he founded officially in 1782. According to his own account, this rite was derived from a manuscript by a certain George Cofton, whose identity has never been discovered, which he bought by chance in London. Yarka, however, expresses the opinion that the rite of Cagliostro was clearly that of Pasquale, and that if he acquired it from a manuscript in London it would indicate that Pasquale had disciples in that city. A far more probable explanation is that Cagliostro derived his Egyptian masonry from the same source as that on which Pasquale had drawn for his order of Martinistes, namely the Kabbalah. And that it was not from a single manuscript, but from an eminent Jewish Kabbalist in London, that he took his instructions. Who this may have been we shall soon see. At any rate, in a contemporary account of Cagliostro we find him described as a doctor initiated into Kabbalistic art, and a Rose-Croix, but after founding his own rite he acquired the name of Grand Coft, that is to say, supreme head of Egyptian masonry. A new branch that he wished to graft onto old European Freemasonry. We shall return to his further Masonic adventures later. In a superior category to Saint Germain and Cagliostro was the famous Swabian Dr. Mesmer, who has given his name to an important branch of natural science. In about 1780 Mesmer announced his great discovery of animal magnetism, the principle of life in all organized beings, the soul of all that breathes. But if today Mesmerism has come to be regarded as almost synonymous with hypnotism, and in no way a branch of occultism. Mesmer himself, stirring the fluid in his magic bucket, around which his disciples wept, slept, fell into trances, or convulsions, raved or prophesied, earned not unnaturally the reputation of a charlatan. The Freemasons, eager to discover the secret of the magic bucket, hastened to enroll him in their order, and Mesmer was received into the primitive rite of Free and accepted Masons in 1785. Space forbids a description of the minor magicians who flourished at this period of Schroeder, founder in 1776 of a chapter of true and ancient Rose-Croix Masons, practicing certain magical, theosophical, and alchemical degrees, of Gassner. Worker of miracles in the neighborhood of Rthes, Bonn, of the Julion, one of a band of charlatans who made large sums of money with magic mirrors in which the imaginative were able to see their absent friends, and who was finally banished from France by the police. All these and many others exploited the credulity and curiosity of the upper classes both in France and Germany between the years of 1740 and 1790. De Lachaux, writing before the French Revolution, describes the part played in their mysteries by the soul of a Kabbalistic Jew named Gabladon, who had lived before Christ, and who predicted that in the year 1800 there will be, on our globe, a very remarkable revolution. And there will be no other religion but that of the patriarchs. How are we to account for this extraordinary wave of Kabbalism in Western Europe? By whom was it inspired? If, as Jewish writers assure us, neither Martinus Pasquale, Saint Germain, Cagliostro, nor any of the visible occultists or magicians were Jews, the problem only becomes the more insoluble. We cannot believe that Sanhedrins, Hebrew hieroglyphics, the contemplation of the Tetragrammaton, and other Kabbalistic rites originated in the brains of French and German aristocrats, philosophers, and Freemasons. Let us turn, then, to events taking place at this moment in the world of Jewry, and see whether these may provide some clue.